So today's Tanya, we're in chapter 6, if I'm not mistaken. And it's the first, very interesting. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that Tanya is a very, very methodical book. Most people, when we look at Tanya, we see, you've been through Tanya, right? We see a lot of,
I've read some of Tanya, but it was so deep, I was like, kept putting me to sleep everywhere I tried to read it.
Right. It's not a simple read.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the Alter Rebbe is what we call Chachma. Chachma is like flashes of insight. So if you read Tanya, it's packed with tremendous amounts of information, right? And a lot of it is very, very succinct, and it maybe needs a teacher to teach it to you. But really the Tanya follows a very, very clear pattern and structure. And if you understand the pattern and structure of the Tanya, the whole thing becomes a lot easier. There are 5 books of the Tanya. There's Likutei Amarim, there's Sharich V'Emunah, there's Igeres HaTshuva, there's Igeres HaKodesh, and Kuntras Achron. The 3 main books of the Tanya, the first 3 books, which are Likutei Amarim, which literally means a collection of sayings, because the Tanya is based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, the Shalach HaKodesh, as well as the Maharal of Prague, as well as the Tanya, the second book of Tanya is called Sharich V'Emunah, which is basically understanding how all of reality is just an expression of God at every single moment, that God is one with reality. You've heard that before, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, you have the third book of the Tanya, it's called the Igeres HaTshuva. And the reason that there's a book on Tshuva in the book of Tanya, which Tanya is really in a way a self-growth book, is because in order to have the whole thing of life is that we have a dichotomy between the mind and the heart. The whole idea of life is that we're able to awaken our godly soul, awaken our love and fear of Hashem. But in order to awaken that, we basically have 3 souls. We have a godly soul, which is very much aware of God, but is almost in exile within the body. It's not necessarily expressed. We have an animal soul, which is very much expressed in the body. And then we have an intellectual soul, which is very much the seeker of truth in us. So we can only really marry the godly soul and the animal soul if the intellectual soul is able to appreciate God. And that is mainly, we do that in davening. Okay. So now we have, Igeres HaTshuva is very important. Why? Because what blocks, normally there should be a direct connection between your mind. If that's a simple example. People know they should eat healthy. Do they eat healthy? Not necessarily. No. Why? Because the body says, I want that food. The mind says, no, that's not a good idea, but the body may be stronger than the mind. So in order for the mind to take over the body has to be humble. Tshuva is, in a sense, connecting with Hashem, also overcoming our own pride, because if a person's prideful, they always want to get their way. Part of tshuva is what we call mora de chushbana, which means that a person has to think about, in fact, all the bad things that I did. Why? Because if I think about those things, then it makes me humble. It's not about remaining in shame, but it's about becoming humble. And then this whole Tanya system can work, because if your mind is not able to control yourself, if the arrogance is too strong, which creates the emotions being very much, I have to get my way. An arrogant person can't not get their way. So then the mind doesn't really have dominance over the emotions. So the first 6 chapters of Tanya, the Tanya begins with the first chapter saying that we have 2 souls. The second chapter going into the second soul, which is the divine soul. The third chapter going into kind of the makeup of the divine soul, which is the intelligence of the divine soul and understanding about God, and how that intelligence turns into an emotion. That's what we call das. And then the fourth chapter goes into what we call the garments of the soul. So the garments of the soul would be the Torah and the mitzvahs, and this, the Alter Rebbe says, is actually greater than the soul itself, because the soul itself is the experiencer, but the experience of is the Torah mitzvahs. And when you do the Torah mitzvahs, he says the Torah mitzvahs is directly connected to Hashem. So when your soul is learning Torah, you're directly connecting to Hashem. And the 5th chapter, I forget, but the 6th chapter goes into the idea, begins to speak about now the animal soul. Now, what is the animal soul? The animal soul, very interestingly, is the exact opposite of the godly soul. So whereas the godly soul is this love for Hashem, the animal soul is the love for what's going to make me feel good. And it also expresses itself in things that make me feel good. What a cheesecake, you know. So now the Alter Rebbe explains to us that there are basically three levels in this world. So there's what we would call the level of kedusha, level of holiness, and this is very, very important. This is really today's Tanya, which is holiness is anything which is the will of Hashem. So that becomes holiness. So what is unholiness then? It is anything which is not the will of Hashem. So in order for Hashem to create a world in which we have freedom of choice, there has to be basically a tremendous amount of what we would call klippa. A klippa is a covering, something that exists. Now, all existence comes from Hashem. It's not possible for something to exist right now. In fact, it says in Gemara, Ein oid milvad, there's nothing but Hashem. Even an idol. If an idol is standing, right now there's an idol in India, who's making that idol? God, right? But the thing is that idol is concealed, the energy that creates that idol, because physical reality equals M, energy is matter. So that physical reality is coming from energy, coming from God, but it gets concealed spiritually. It goes through these many, 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 many layers of concealments called simsumim until it can create something which actually opposes God, right? Simple example is this. Let's say you have a company. Mm-hmm. And in your company, you want your son to learn the business. So you start off and you say, wow, this kid's a lazy bum. He's not doing anything. So you actually hire a manager to manage your son. And the manager comes and he says, well, what are you doing? You're not waking up in time. And he's just harassing this kid. So there's the same thing as like, this is really the father doing it. But the father himself can't harass his own child. So he hires somebody else to harass the child, to get the child to do what the father wants. Same thing as the klippa is this world which is really there, only there for us to do the will of Hashem. But it's still, at the same time, it's really concealing the will of Hashem. The pig is really against the will of Hashem. And so in later chapters, we're going to go into how each thing is either connected to the will of Hashem or disconnected. But just to conclude this one point, then we'll take questions. So the idea is that anything which is the will of Hashem gets its energy directly from Hashem. So right now we're studying Torah, we're getting direct energy from Hashem. If we're, eating cheesecake just because it tastes good, then it would go through all these klippa, which is having desires which are not the will of Hashem, just selfish desires. If, God forbid, we were literally transgressing the will of Hashem, not only a klippa, which is just kosher cheesecake, but non-kosher cheesecake, then it would be even a deeper klippa, a deeper concealment of the will of Hashem. L'chaim v'levracha.